Hello everyone, I'm Rob, Content Strategist at Gather Content, and I'm going to be talking to you today about how to successfully deliver content for website projects. So in the next 45 minutes, we'll be looking at some key components that are needed to deliver website content on time and in budget. So more specifically, we're going to cover what Content First is and why you should work that way, the roles needed for your content team and where you can find them, how to design a content production workflow collaboratively with stakeholders, how to estimate the time needed to deliver content, and we'll use a typical workflow as an example to help us with that. And then we'll finish with how to prioritize content. So let's start with going content first. Now, if you're an agency working with clients on website projects such as a redesign, or perhaps you're part of an in-house team working on your own organization's website redesign, then you may have experienced some of these common pains of content delivery. Perhaps you didn't have the right people to deliver the content, so you know what you needed to do and when you needed to do it, but there was nobody there to actually get the content done. There was nobody to write it, review it, publish it, etc. And we'll come on to roles a bit more later on in the presentation. Perhaps you did have the right people though. Perhaps you did have your team all assembled and ready to go, but they didn't have the right process or tools in place to deliver the content. So there was no infrastructure around them to help them get that content done. Perhaps there was confusion over what content to deliver. So there may have been conflicting priorities or just a lack of understanding on what needed to be produced, what needed to be ditched from the existing content, where there were gaps for new content, and what needed to be refined and in what way. Why did it need to be refined or repurposed before it was published on the new site? So there might be complete confusion there over the deliverables and the priorities around content. Perhaps you were caught up by the scale of delivering content. Now, this is something that often happens when I worked at an agency with clients. It was very common. And in my job here as content strategist at Gather Content, I speak to a lot of institutions, organizations, and again, agencies, and it's still a very common thing. Content often takes a lot more resource, time, money, effort than people allow for and think that is needed. And they get caught out by that, and often they get caught out at very crucial stages of a project, often much further down the line as the launch day is approaching. So content can delay the launch of a website because you may actually just not have it. You may not have the content that you need. Or if you do, it may be poor quality because it's been rushed, or you've just had to use the existing content because that's all you're able to do given the circumstance, but that existing content isn't in the correct voice and tone or isn't accurate anymore. So it may be poor quality. And budgets blow out as the project churns. So projects can be left in limbo. If there's no content, the website never gets finished, the final invoice doesn't go, everything's just there hanging, motivation plummets. Or you scramble around and you suddenly scale up your team to get everything done on time, well, not on time, but get everything done. And the budgets just blow as you're just chucking money out to get people in to get the content delivered. And ultimately the overall user experience can suffer if the content's being rushed or not considered or just isn't actually a priority for the project. But going content first can alleviate some of those pains. It can't get rid of everything. There'll always be challenges and obstacles, and content will always be difficult. But it can be easier. And those pains don't need to be the way that you work or common or expected. So content first means considering content early in website projects and asking the right questions up front to help clients successfully deliver content on time and in budget. And not just clients, any stakeholders if you're part of an in-house team as well. And that's really important. It's about getting content on the agenda early on in projects so you can bring together everybody that you need. So that's content, design, development, UX, it may even extend to other teams, legal, finance, marketing. Bring everybody together around a shared understanding of what content needs to produce and what the purpose of that content is. So what content first doesn't mean is having all final and approved content up front before any design work starts. I mean, imagine that. That would be the holy grail of website projects. And if that's the way you work, then please get in touch with me and tell me how you're doing it, because I would love to be in that situation. But I think it's a common perception that content first, people do think that it means getting all the content up front. So before you even do anything, you need all this content written and produced and signed off. And that's not true. And if you think that, then it's an intimidating thought. And I can see why people panic and why content doesn't actually get delivered. But it's not that. It's just about thinking about content early on in the project. So these are some pre-project content questions that you might ask. And you may do this as soon as you get a request for a new website from a stakeholder, or as soon as a potential client gets in touch saying they want a new website for themselves. This is when you may ask those questions. Or you may ask them during your project proposal and scoping phase and documentation. You may ask them during a workshop or a session in your discovery phase. It doesn't really matter when, because you will need to find a way that best suits your process. The key thing is as early as possible in your project, or even pre-project if you can as well. So you can ask things like, do we know how much content we have on our current site? What is our starting point? What is the content landscape that we're moving from? That's really important to know. It's not just about where you're heading, it's about where you're starting from. So this is what we've got. Because actually, there may be some nice insights there where you think, we've got a lot of content that is still purposeful, useful, accurate, relevant, etc. On the other hand, it could reveal lots of gaps and it could cause some panic. But at least you know early on what you're going to be faced with. It's better to know as soon as possible. Do you know what quality your content is in? Is it those things I just mentioned? Is it accurate and purposeful? Is it on brand, in the right voice and tone? Is it high quality? Is it effective? Do you know who the subject matter experts are and the owners for the current content? And if so, are they going to be involved in owning the content on the new site? And if not, who is going to be involved? Do you expect to archive old and poor quality content from the new site? So what's going to be archived and why? And what gaps will that leave? Or what gaps will that reveal? Do you know who's going to write or rewrite all of the content for the new site? Now that's really important, because if you don't, then you really need to start considering this. We'll come on to assembling content teams and the key roles shortly in this presentation. But do you know who's actually going to get the content done? Does someone have overall responsibility for content quality during the project and beyond? So a lot of website projects, the focus is just on launch day, launch day, launch day. But what about once the website is launched? It still lives, it still serves a purpose. It must be governed and maintained. So who's going to be responsible for that? Do you know how many hours per week will be dedicated to that governance? And how many are currently dedicated to it? So will the process need to be scaled up, scaled back, or is it fine as it is? And do you know if any content is syndicated from other systems and what implications that has on the technology and the process for this project? And finally, another question you can ask is, do you have a content style guide? If not, are you going to create one before the content? Are you going to create the content and then let that inform the style guide? How's that going to work? Well, ultimately, a style guide is important to ensure any ongoing content production is consistent and authentic with the house style. So some of the benefits of going content first on your website project: save time. You'll save time because you'll be thinking about the content early on, you'll be planning, you'll be making informed decisions about the content, you'll be bringing together all the different teams, you'll save time. You'll also save money. Should be fewer rounds of amends on both the design and the content, actually. So you should save money because your project will stay on track. And the content will be better. It will be better because you'll be thinking about the technology needed to publish the content. You'll be thinking about the audience and their needs. You'll be thinking about your business goals that the content needs to meet. And you'll be thinking about how it's going to get done and get through your workflow. And again, workflow is something we'll be coming on to shortly. So all of that means that your projects will stay on track. And if you are an agency and you're going content first and you're able to offer content strategy as a billable service, perhaps you can also experience some growth through taking a content first approach to your website projects. And a bit more detail now into what you can expect from being content first, just to make the final case for taking this approach to your website project. So you'll reduce project rollout delays caused by underestimating the content production challenge. You won't get halfway into a project and suddenly realize there is a mountain of content to be produced and you don't know who's going to do it, when they're going to do it, how they're going to do it. So it will reduce project rollout delays because you'll be able to include in your project timeline, schedule and plan the content phase, the content production phase. You won't waste time and budget designing and building functionality and templates that fail to handle real content. You won't create this amazing design that everybody loves and signs off, and then you get the content and realize, actually, they don't go together. So then what do? Do you change the design that everybody loves and has approved to accommodate the content? Or do you change the content to fit the design and then compromise on the quality of that content? So you're not just building things and designing things with no context. And then you're not going to waste time and budget. You also make smarter content-focused design decisions for a better user experience, and you'll be able to grow your agency by offering content strategies as a billable service. Now, if you're an in-house team, You're not necessarily striving for growth, but you'll still be able to be more efficient by taking a content-first approach to your projects. You'll be able to really have efficient and effective content operations with the right people and infrastructure around that. You'll also be able to launch projects on time, and then you won't be delayed sending that file invoice. Keep coming back to saving time and money. Two really great things to save. I know lots of teams and agencies are striving for that. So, it's really important to iterate, or emphasize rather, how important content-first approach can be for the bottom line and for the stress levels and for the efficiency of a team and of an agency. And you can deliver great sites that your clients and internal stakeholders can sustain, and that can build trust and win repeat business if that's what you're striving for. Or, if it's an in-house team, again, it'll just build trust with those stakeholders. But you can deliver sites that can be sustained. So once the project's been launched, perhaps your team is scaled back a bit, there's fewer resources, yet you can still handle it and make sure that the content on the site is relevant, accurate, and up to date. So we've talked a bit about a process and an approach to your projects, going content first. But to do that, you need people. So the next section of the talk, we're just going to look at some of the roles involved in a content team. And there's a list of key roles here. So we've got content strategists, writers and content designers, senior editor, subject matter expert, user researcher, CMS editor, delivery manager. Now, a caveat to this part of the talk is that as I'm talking about these key roles, typical roles, you may have other labels for them. There's so many job titles these days. I don't want to get bogged down in semantics, but as I'm talking about a content strategist, you may be actually, our project manager does that, and our marketing person does that. Oh, we've got a copywriter that does that. That's fine. I appreciate that there may be different job titles, but we will look at the skills and responsibilities for these people. And the key thing is just to consider what a typical content delivery team will need to be able to do collectively. And the final sort of caveat here is that one person might actually fulfill several of these roles. I certainly do at my role here at Gather Content. I'm the content strategist. I also write the content, edit the content, and edit other people's content. So, there may be one person who's wearing multiple hats, and that's fine too. So the content strategist, so the skills that they ideally will have is that they can define the content required to meet user needs and business goals. So they will have to have a deep understanding both the business side and the audience side, along with extensive digital communication experience and experience of designing with content as well, because they'll be responsible for developing the content models for the templates, developing the content governance strategy, and also producing content style guides. Now, they'll be doing lots of other things as well, particularly if they are multiple hat wearing content strategists. They might be writing the content, and there's also, defining the workflow, which we'll come on to. There's lots of other things they could be doing. But this is just some key and core responsibilities for somebody in this role. And you might find them in-house. You might already have an in-house content strategist, like I am at Gather Content. If you're working with an agency, they may have one that's assigned to your project, or it may be that you look for a freelancer or consultant for a particular project. And the writers and content designers. So they'll be researching and consulting subject matter experts. They'll be drafting and revising the content and sourcing relevant media if needed. So they will need writing for the web experience, an ability to apply a style guide, and domain knowledge. So that's an in-depth knowledge of a particular subject or topic. So collaboration is key here, because if they don't have that domain knowledge because perhaps they're not in-house and they've just been brought in for a project, they need to build the relationships with the subject matter experts in order to get that domain knowledge to produce the content that's needed. So you may have them in-house, could be from your agency again, could be a freelancer or consultant, or a specialist content agency may be able to provide that role for you. And the senior editor, they must have significant writing for the web experience, be intimate with the project objectives, like what is the purpose of the content, what are you trying to achieve? Again, the domain knowledge and the relationship and credibility with the SMEs, the subject matter experts. So that's where they can get the domain knowledge if they don't already have it. And they're responsible for QA and reviewing all the content, owning and enforcing the style guide. They may even produce the style guide if they're fulfilling several roles, owning the content production process. And again, this may cross over with the content strategist. This may be the content strategist, but it's just important to know that somebody within your content delivery team will need to be responsible for these tasks. So ideally, they will be in-house because they'll have those relationships and knowledge that they can use to their advantage to get content delivered on time and in budget. Subject matter experts, mentioned them quite a bit already. Very, very important in any team. They're responsible for providing the information and data, reviewing content accuracy, because they're the experts, they know what they're talking about. The ongoing ownership of content after launch, so they'll be responsible for owning the content within their own domain. And they should be available for consultation both during the project and after to allow for that governance to be effective. So they must have an authoritative voice, access to accurate information. They must value communicating the subject. Chances are they will be passionate about it. However, they may not see producing content about it as their priority. And we'll come on to that a bit later. And they must be a willing project partner. And actually going content first can help with those things there, because you're involving people early in the process. They feel involved, they feel they understand the process, and that can really help start to build those relationships, build that trust, and facilitate effective collaboration throughout the project lifecycle as you need. So yeah, they should be in-house, but they may be spread far and wide across an organization, depending on what size of company you're involved with or you're working with. The user researcher, again, could be one of the roles we've already discussed. So they must be experienced in research. They must be able to interpret the feedback into actionable insights, and they must value and champion user needs. So they're batting for the audience here to make sure the content they produce meets their user need. So they plan user research activities, they recruit the representatives, they run the testing and the research, and then they report on that. And the key thing here is disseminating the findings from that research to anybody that does need to action it. And again, communication and collaboration, absolutely key. And a user researcher must be able to do that effectively. They may be in-house, they may be at an agency. Again, you may bring in a specialist for a particular project. And the CMS editor. So technology and the infrastructure is a very important part of anyone's content operations. So somebody must be confident with the CMS and experience of populating the page templates, and then these are their responsibilities: the ongoing maintenance of the site, building pages, adding links, images, and files, applying metadata such as taxonomy labels, and formatting the content to work in the templates. And really, they should be in-house, because they should understand the technology, be able to train others within the organization on using that, on using the CMS if needed, and being able to manage that whole process, whether they're using something like Gather Content to integrate with the CMS, or whether they're having to train somebody to manually copy and paste content into the CMS, or do that themselves. There must be somebody who owns that part of the workflow and part of the process. And then a delivery manager, so somebody with experience of content production projects and excellent project management skills. And they may be called the project manager, the studio manager, the client account manager. Again, lots of job titles that might actually be how you describe this person in your organization. But ultimately, they're responsible for tracking the progress of content production, prioritizing the content that needs to be produced, which is our final section of this talk today, removing the roadblocks once they've been identified, and overall project delivery, overseeing the overall project. And often this is a content strategist as well. They're the ones that are kind of doing the work at the beginning, bringing the people in that they need to get content to the workflow, but overseeing and managing that process. So they may be in-house at the agency that you've employed or that you're working with. And again, it could be a freelancer or an external consultant that's brought in as needed. But the key thing here is there is somebody responsible for the overall delivery. So even though everybody's got their own roles within the team and within the workflow, there has to be somebody to drive it and keep an eye on it and have that bird's eye view as well. But, that's just a small list, really, of potential people that might make up your content delivery team. Depending on the project, there may be other hats and roles to consider. Photographers, videographers, illustrators, lawyers, marketing folk. It's not just about the writers. And again, some of those roles we've discussed may also fill these roles. Your content strategist might be part of the marketing team and might be able to do some of that. You might have finance involved. It really does depend on your project and your organization and your team structure. But there may be lots of other roles to consider. I just wanted to cover some key skills and responsibilities that any content delivery team really needs to have. And then scaling your team up and down is really important to consider as well. Because as you start a project, website redesign project, for example, you may bring people on board to help you get that content done, help you get that project delivered on time. So whether that's just growing your own in-house team, employing an agency and bringing in consultants, you'll be scaling up your team to fulfill the roles that you need to deliver content and deliver that website project. So once that launch day has happened, you may then need to scale back. So contracts may end. People may slide back into original roles that they were fulfilling before they were brought into the project. And that's fine. In some cases, that's definitely to be expected. But what that means is that you need to consider who will be governing and maintaining that content post-launch. What is the process post-launch? Will you have to change your workflow? Will you need different people? How is that going to work? So many website projects are just focused on launch day and getting a website live that often there's not enough thought on what happens after that. And if you bring in people in and then they're leaving once their website's live, it's really important to consider the impact that will have on the governance and maintenance of the website and of the content, keeping that content relevant, making sure that content continues to meet a business goal and or a user need. So now we'll look at designing a content production workflow. I've mentioned workflow a few times, and it really is just the process that you will adopt to get content done, to get your content delivered. The stages that content will pass through so that it's ready to be published and then governed. So this is a typical content production workflow, and I use the word typical because, again, as with the job roles where there could be lots of different titles and other people involved, you may look at this typical content production workflow and it could resonate with you entirely, and you may think, actually, ours is very different. But that's fine, because what I've called write, review, and revise, for example, you might call something else. You might have different labels or your own internal vocabulary for these different workflow stages. That's absolutely fine, as long as it's relevant and your team is aware of what the terminology is. That's perfect. And it may be that your workflow is much smaller, might have half the stages because it's quite a small team or quite a straightforward process or piece of content you're trying to deliver. It could be the other way though, where it's actually more complex. You might have several feedback loops, one for legal, one for finance, one for marketing, for example. So I'm aware that this may not be exactly the way that you need to work, but what I think is important is just by considering some typical stages of a production workflow, it really brings to light the scale of content delivery and production. So briefing and page table. So you need to start with an idea of what you're creating, what content you're creating. And not only what content, but who's going to create it, who is it for, what purpose does it serve? Again, it must meet a business goal and or a user need, or else I would question why it exists. So, it's better rather than just jump straight to production, writing just to try and get the content done. Spend the time to create a brief or a page table to think of what content needs to be produced, who for and why. And it may be that you need to research as part of that. So that's fine. You may have the knowledge already, and you may have existing content that you can just kind of use as a starting point, but you may need to do some research around a particular topic or whatever that may be. So if that's necessary, give that its own stage. Don't just try and suck that up into other stages. It's really important to take the time to research, get the knowledge you need, whether that's sitting with subject matter experts, however that may be. But what research you need to do before you can actually start the next stage, which is writing the content. So the actual doing, the actual production. I think that stage speaks for itself. It's quite straightforward. But once you have got a draft of your content, you may need to test it. You may need to iterate on that. So that could be, you might literally be sharing a document with someone just to get initial feedback. Could be that you're testing it in a prototype. However that may be, it depends how your design and development cycles are working in line with your content production workflow. But you may need to do some level of user testing, whether that's with internal stakeholders or with your clients' customers, for example. And following that, you then may need to review the content. There may be some insights there that of cause you to review, rather than just go straight to approval and uploading. And if you're reviewing it, then chances are you may need to revise that content based on whatever insights you've derived from the user testing. So hopefully it's not that you need to start again and write something from scratch, but it may be that some refinement is needed depending on what that feedback was. And then, of course, once it is approved, it needs to be uploaded to the CMS. So actually put into the thing that's going to publish it to the website. Again, I think that stage is quite straightforward in what's needed. Hopefully, there's a person within a team who understands the CMS well enough to be able to do that, efficiently. And then you may even want to review it in HTML, so you've got that kind of contextual review of the content or you may want to skip straight to the next step, which is publishing. And of course, once it's been published, as we've already said a couple of times already, then that content needs to be governed and maintained. But that is a separate talk in itself. But it's worth having out there just for food for thought, that once the website is live, it's not necessarily the end of the journey for your content. So a good way to run a content production or to define a content production workflow is to run a workshop. And this is where you can collaborate with people and bring them together. So if you run a content production workflow planning workshop, not easy to say, you can begin to design an appropriate process for the project, because one workflow might not be right for all of your clients or all of your projects. So you may need to do this on a project by project basis. So, and you can bring the relevant people in. Again, it might be the subject matter experts or the stakeholders, to try and engage them early on in the project, which will hopefully make stages later in your workflow a bit easier to accomplish. You can explore the challenge of content production as a content team, and you can identify the gaps and the red flags early. And that's really important. It's not just what you've got, it's what you've not got and what you need. And a workshop like this with a particular group of people in the room can really bring to light the gaps and the red flags, and create a moment to put content center stage in the project. Again, content first, get it on the agenda, get people thinking about it before it's too late, before it derails the project and causes the budgets to blow and the timelines to just falter. Really put it center stage, and in a way that's engaging to people, and they can be involved in the conversation too. The content team are more likely to adopt their own solution. It's a really good way of getting people together around that shared understanding. Again, understanding what the workflow is that you've designed together, where they fit into that workflow, where the content's been before it reaches them, where it's going next, and what they need to do at their particular part of the workflow. And it can inform the content governance post-launch as well. So as early as you can run the workshop in your project, the better. And I'd say 2 hours is a good time for this. I mean, it does depend on the number of people who've got involved, but around 2 hours is a good enough time to actually allow everybody to contribute and for there to be some really good outcomes. So we should have a facilitator. Put here as the content strategist. It may be somebody else, but ultimately somebody who is experienced at facilitating. It's a real skill. And then some of the people you might want to invite: service managers, product owners, editors, writers, people involved in the CMS and technology, subject matter experts. If you partner with somebody external, like an agency, a representative from there. It really does depend, but all the key stakeholders, in the project for sure. So book a large room with wall space and breakout areas, and then you're going to need lots of post-it notes, colored Sharpies, blank paper, and if there are, designs available, then print them off as well. So this first stage is just mapping the production workflow. So take about 20 to 30 minutes and think about what the workflow steps are for producing an example piece of content. Now, it might be a good idea to pick the example content before the workshop and share that with people. Right, our example content is going to be, the international student visas page, or a 750 word page, whatever it is that you decide. Either share that beforehand or make it clear up front at this stage what the example is. Then split into teams with a mix of roles. And you might want to share a generic process diagram as a model. So, like we've got that, the typical workflow that we've already been through. You might want to share that for inspiration or something to work from. And if there's any designs, print those out and share those as well. And then basically just get the teams, or if you're doing it as one or separate teams, however you're doing it, just use a post-it note for each stage. So get people to write down what they think the stages are that the content needs to go through. And of course, the benefit there, once you've stuck them on the wall, is you can move them around as needed. And it also helps. It's a really good exercise in understanding the vocabulary within your organization or for your client or the customers, thinking about the way that they describe certain stages as well. And then add the humans. So another 10 minutes perhaps for this part. Assign and label a personal role to each stage of the process. So if you've got review as a step, for example, who is responsible for the review? Again, there may be several people depending on the situation, but look, are all the assigned roles already filled? Are there gaps? So do you need to bring someone in to fill those gaps? Is there someone already on the team that can fill that gap? But also, is the same person appearing again and again? And if so, what are the implications of that? So really start to think, all right, we've got the stages, now we're adding in the people. What does that look like for you? And then you can call out the pain points. So for example, if there's somebody who's being assigned to multiple workflow stages, is that going to cause a bottleneck? Can they actually, is it not possible for them to do everything they need to do? So again, you start to think about what are the potential pain points and how can you overcome them? If you've got a lack of skills within the team, are there known issues, potential bottlenecks? What are the internal politics? And you can always add red dots to these for visual impact as well to help you see where in the workflow the potential pain points will appear. And if you do have time, say 15 minutes, then perhaps you can start thinking of solutions to those as well. Try and mitigate or smooth out those potential pain points. Will software or systems and tools alleviate them? Is there something with your current technique that you need to change or that you can adapt? Really start to think about, right, how we're going to overcome these pain points. And the fact that you're doing this before any content production has started is really, really fantastic. And estimating in fractions how much effort it takes to get the content through each stage. I'll come on to that shortly, but this is really important as well. I mentioned at the start that content's often grossly underestimated in terms of how much effort it takes. So it's really important to start thinking about that, even if they're just ballparks. You may not know for sure, but any thinking you can do around this is really, really important. And even if the number you come up with is scary, it's better to know that now than when it's too late. So be realistic there. Go with previous experience, and try and estimate as much as you can. And then, if you wanted to pitch and critique, then now is a good time just to present your workflow to the rest of the team, especially if you've done it in separate groups. You could record it for those that couldn't attend or for reference after the workshop's finished. Encourage questions and discussion around that, and take any photos as needed. But it's a really good chance to discuss the outcomes and the next steps of the workflow that you've created in collaboration. And so the things to consider after the workshop: how you're going to disseminate that workflow to the team, especially if there's people who are involved in it that couldn't be there. Do you need to visualize it? And who's going to manage that process of disseminating it and just making sure that the workflow is adhered to? Again, is it going to be the delivery manager, the content strategist? Only you can decide, but just knowing that you need somebody to manage that is really, really important. Estimating the effort to deliver content. So, we just talked about estimation there within that workshop, and this is where some scary numbers can be produced, but it's a really, really valuable task to do. So again, it's another activity. And one way you could do this, if you're not going to, have the workshop, or this is after the workshop happened, you need to do the estimation. So you may not do any of all the post-it notes up in front of you. You could create a Google Sheet with each stage of your workflow, and you could add an estimate for the accumulated hours to complete each stage, and then total the estimates, and that'll give you some sense. It's not science, but it will give you some sense. And in our content strategy masterclass, we've done dozens of those classes over the years to try and do one a quarter, and we've had thousands of participants across those. And we do have a Google Sheet in there with our typical workflow outlined, and we ask the participants to jump into the sheet and estimate the time it would take to get a simple 750 word page through each stage of that typical workflow. And the average across all those classes is actually 15 hours. So if it's 15 hours to do one 750 word page, if you scale it up to an entire website, it starts to get quite scary. But again, it's good to know this stuff up front so you can plan for it as best as you can, whether that's, scaling up your team, bringing in, changing the processes, bringing in new tools, etc., to help with your content operations. And here's an example from one of the masterclasses. So as you can see, participants there on the left, all the stages, and then the total. So actually in this class, the total was just over 20 hours to get that piece of content through the workflow. But it does vary. Somebody here's got 35 hours, somebody's got 8. So, it can vary significantly from team to team, project to project, organization to organization. But creating this spreadsheet and actually getting your team and your stakeholders to think about the effort needed at each stage can be really, really valuable. So I'd encourage you, to do that. And then prioritizing content. So content is political, and if there's lots of people involved, they will have their own priorities, and that can be tricky. That often results in difficult conversations, having to say no to people. But really, it's still very important. Let's not be intimidated by that. It's very important to spend the time prioritizing content with the users in mind. Yes, you have to think about the business, of course, but really asking questions about the content in order to prioritize it. So let's look at that in a bit more detail. Now, you could do another workshop. I mean, I am a fan of workshops. I'm mindful, though, that they do take a lot of time and effort. But if you don't do a workshop, then you can still do some of these tasks outside of that kind of setting. So you should produce, if you are going to do a workshop or just whatever method you use for having these discussions, the goals really should be to produce a clearly prioritized single backlog of content for the project. Identify the content that be archived. It doesn't need to be rewritten. So again, don't spend time on the things you don't need to spend time on. And build a shared consensus of what is most important to work on. Now, if you've got clear objectives for the website and a good audience understanding, and data as well, then they're really important ways to combat anybody who is insistent that their priority should be number one, because it may not be that actually that's the best thing for the website for the audience. But rather than just say, what's your priority? What's your priority? Obviously people are going to say what means most to them. You need to think about it in a much wider landscape, really. And key to that is breaking the decision into different questions to achieve more credible and satisfactory prioritization. So you can start asking questions such as, is this unique to the client or the business, or can similar content already be found elsewhere? Does the content directly support a business and or user goal? And if so, which ones? And if not, why does that content exist and why should it be a priority? Is the content frequently required or just occasionally? So somebody may think, well, this content is absolutely number one priority, but it may not be that it is frequently required. And other content that they may think is a low priority is more often required. So you have to think about it in different ways, and try and get people to think beyond their own situations, their own content goals, and their own silos as well. Is the content relevant to lots of users or just a few? That can really be insightful, just asking that question in relation to all the content. And are you obliged, either, is your client obliged, or are you as an organization obliged, legally or politically, to have content? It may not be anyone's priority, but it may actually be required. So it's really important to consider that as well, and what implication that has on the other content and how you prioritize things. So those five questions there, it can be a really effective way to actually prioritize your content. And you won't always get everybody to agree all the time. Unfortunately, that is just the way things are. But by asking these questions, you're not asking what's your priority. You're getting people to think about the content in relation to the business, to the audience, to the goals, and hopefully there will be some common ground and some ability there to prioritize, as an organization and as a project team. So, as a team, you can work through each item of content one at a time, asking those questions, get all the participants to reveal their prioritization score at the same time. If you all agree straight away, brilliant. It doesn't need further discussion, move on. If you don't agree, then you do need further discussion. And again, those 5 questions could be a good agenda for that. And here's an example, another spreadsheet. And the thing with the scoring here, it's up to you whether one is the lowest priority or the highest priority. The key thing is that everybody who's doing the scoring and is involved in this process understands the method and what those numbers mean, so it's consistent. So it's up to you to choose. But you can just list all the content. You might do it as per a sitemap or content inventory that you've already got, which will save you some time. List the content and then add in your criteria. So here we've got, is it unique to the client, helpful to users, frequently required, relevant to lots of users, obligatory. So we've used those 5 questions there as the criteria. You may have different criteria. You may have more, you may have less. But add whatever your criteria is to the spreadsheet and then get the relevant people within the project team and organization to score that. And then that will hopefully give you some list of priorities. And then you can start thinking of how you're going to roll out that content. It may be that you do things in phases. So anything that's like an 8 to 10 is phase 1. 5 to 6 is phase 2. However that's going to work out, you can really start to think about phases, because often it's not a case of saying no to people. It's just saying we will come to that piece of content that is your top priority, but it will be in phase 2, phase 3. And communication and managing expectations goes a long, long way. Other prioritization prioritization methods I don't have time to cover in this chat. Dot voting, the Moscow method, and the Rice method. I have written about those for WebTuts Plus in an article titled "How to Prioritize Content for Your Website Project," and there is a link to that there. So, if you're not as keen to do a workshop, or it's just not feasible for you, or you don't like the spreadsheet idea, then perhaps one of those 3 methods would be more suitable to the way that you'd like to work. So, if you want to check out that article with additional advice, then please do. And we're really coming to the end now. I just wanted to talk a little bit about collaboration. Now, I think going content first, having workshops, deciding things together, bringing teams together around a shared understanding of the purpose of content, that in itself is really good collaboration. But the key thing is there's no one size fits all to producing content. One workflow isn't going to work for you for every project and every client. Your team isn't always going to be exactly the same. There'll be more people one time and then you will need so many people the next time. But collaboration is always needed. And there's a scale here, silo one end, collaborative the next. So if you're not consulting with subject matter experts, people are working in silos. You need to connect those silos. You can start by asking SMEs to populate questionnaires, for example. Perhaps you'll take it a step further and do face-to-face or phone interviews. You might sit with them and do page table mapping. You might pair write with them, and that's brilliant because as a subject matter expert, they've got all the domain knowledge and the expertise. And as the content strategist or delivery manager, whatever role you're fulfilling, you know the style and you know the purpose of the content, you know the objectives of the project, you know the objectives of the content. So together you sit and write, and it's just a better use of time. The SME can go back to what they need to do. It's not just sending them an email out of the blue asking them to produce content. It's really giving them a big helping hand in getting that content done. So pair writing is a really effective collaboration technique that I would encourage you to try with any of your subject matter experts as well. And think, when it comes to producing the content, which is just one stage of the workflow, but think about this in relation to the people you need to collaborate with. Who is producing the content? How familiar are the writers with the content? How complex is it? How much time do you have? How do the content producers like or want to work with subject matter experts? And what is the existing relationship, if there is one? What are the expectations for ongoing engagement with the subject matter experts? And how many of them are there? Asking these questions will really help you find ways of working that are most effective for your content delivery team. So a quick recap as we reach the end, just before Q&A. So we've covered what content first is and why you should work that way, the roles needed for your content team and where to find them, how to design a content production workflow collaboratively with stakeholders, how to estimate the time needed to deliver content using a typical workflow as an example to help us with that exercise, and then how to prioritize content and think about how you're going to work collaboratively on content with your subject matter experts. So thank you for listening today. Please do keep in touch. You can find me on Twitter @Robert Mills, or you can email me rob@gathercontent.com. Thank you very much.